Welcome to the Global Peace Film Festival Lives Online Conversation 2021 Festival Edition. Please join me, Kelly Devine, Artistic Director, and Nina Streit, Executive Director, in conversation with Bennett Singer, the director of CURED. His film is a part of our September festival. You can learn all of the details and updates about his screening opportunities and other events by visiting peacefilmfest.org. Our in-person screenings begin September 20th and run through September 26th. And then our streaming online accessibility begins September 27th and ends October 3rd. So if you missed something in the in-person screening or loved it and wanted to make sure your friends get a chance to watch it as well, please be sure to check out the virtual screenings. And now let's talk to Bennett Singer. Welcome.
Hello, hello. Great to be here.
Welcome, Bennett, and it's good to see you. And first of all, in addition to telling us about your film, also want you to acknowledge your co-director.
Right. I was thinking the same thing. This was very much a team effort. And in fact, the concept for CURED, which, gosh, we've been working on since 2015. So it's been quite a long process. But the concept for CURED did come from Patrick Salmon, who I co-directed and co-produced the film with. He's an old friend, and I had consulted on his last film, which was a project about Alan Turing, the gay British code breaker, which is called Codebreaker. And through that process, we decided to team up on this project, and it's been actually such a positive collaboration. So very much happy to be at this point in the process and have gone through it with Patrick.
And tell us about the film.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the film for people who haven't seen it.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here, and I'm so impressed by all of the efforts and work and impact that you're making through the film festival, and just the notion of global peace. Keeping that in people's consciousness is more urgent than ever, and I think has so many different permutations, including, I would say, the story that was documented in CURED. The starting point really is that when the American Psychiatric Association published its first manual of mental illnesses back in 1952, homosexuality was classified as a mental disorder, and a very particular kind of mental disorder. I happen to have the page here, but it was under the heading sociopathic personality disturbance. And the language was that individuals placed in this category are mentally ill in terms of society and of conformity with prevailing cultural milieu. So basically, that diagnosis was saying that gay people were sick and pathological and sociopaths as a result of their same-sex desires and their sexual orientation, and that and really every gay person under that rubric was classified as mentally ill, and not only mentally ill, but actually in need of a cure. And psychiatrists did really espouse the idea that people could be treated and cured. So what this film is about is really looking at the activists and their allies within the medical world who took on that diagnosis and said, we don't think we're sick, we don't feel that we need to be cured. Or, as one set of demands put it, there is no cure for that which is not a disease. And it was a relatively long process that started in the mid-60s and culminated in 1973, when I would say, despite what might have been anticipated or predicted, the APA did in fact change its manual of mental illnesses and removed homosexuality. So it was no longer a mental illness. And at that point, as one of the people in the film says, 20 million people were cured with the stroke of a pen, because what had been classified as an illness was no longer actually deemed a sickness. And so it's absolutely a story about activism, social change, the process of taking on what might seem like an impossible opponent, and through, I think, some very clever and strategic and smart tactics, which involved a mix of insiders and outsiders. The ultimate message, I think, is that, change is possible, systemic, lasting social change. And I do think in terms of when you're looking at, modern LGBTQ history, of course, Stonewall was a huge turning point. But when this change happened, the gay task force at the time called it the greatest gay victory. And I think, in some ways that's not hyperbole. This really was a turning point in terms of a concrete action that opened up a lot of potential for civil rights and for civil equality. And things did start to change after 1973 in a dramatic way on the road towards fuller equality and fuller citizenship. And I think the other big aspect of why this all matters is that apart from the political and cultural aspects of what this battle was about, it was also so much about dignity and about how people think of themselves. And as another activist in the film says, nothing makes you sick like believing you're sick or being told that you're sick. And so the removal of this label, this cloud that was hanging over the heads of every LGBTQ person, I think was a huge turning point as well.
Well, in listening to that description, one of the things that occurs to me is that even within the scientific method and the scientific rubric, there are still too many opportunities to overlook our own unconscious biases and to overlook our cultural frames as opposed to actual scientific frames, right?
Absolutely, and that is such a theme of this film, because it's fascinating that both sides of this debate actually claim to have science on their side. The psychiatrists were saying, well, we have these scientific studies and we've shown that this is a sickness and that it can be cured. What I think those proponents weren't anticipating is that on the other side were a group of activists led by Dr. Frank Kameny, who had gotten his PhD from Harvard in astronomy and was in fact a government scientist until the government decided to fire him because he was part of this purge of homosexuals who were deemed security risks and subversive, and they were kicked out of their jobs for the US government. And so that turned Frank Kameny into this accidental activist, but at his heart and his core, Frank Kameny was a scientist. And so he was able to cut through and analyze the arguments that were being used by the people who said this is indeed a sickness and we have data. And he was able to look at that. And there's a great line in the film where he calls it shabby, sleazy, shoddy pseudoscience. And I think, there really is that aspect of cutting through the bogus kinds of science. And Kameny would say, well, you have this study, but look at the sample. If you're looking at 100 gay patients who come to psychiatrists seeking to be cured, and that's the basis for your evidence, and you say, well, 67% were cured, you can't extrapolate. Like you learn that in 6th grade science, I think. And yet it really was that kind of reasoning that was at the heart of the so-called scientific diagnosis that psychiatrists were clinging to and advocating. And so I think a lot of what the story is about related to this is that members of the APA had a chance to consider both sides of this debate. And actually there was a vote, which is on one level quite a surprising and kind of crazy way to determine whether something is or isn't a valid diagnosis. But through a long process that is documented in the film, every APA member had a chance to vote on whether to affirm what their board had decided on. In other words, homosexuality would be removed from the DSM. And the majority of APA members did vote to affirm the board's decision. And I think in that way really became allies. They considered the science, they considered the evidence, they considered the data, And the political aspects, although I don't agree with people who say this was just a political maneuver and those gay activists pushed this through, and it was really more about like pressure and political, um, pressure versus science. I think there were political tactics involved, but the goal of those tactics was to look at the science. And ultimately it was about science, and the APA members voted to affirm what was essentially a scientific decision that overcame the prejudice that I think had really been underlying the inclusion of this diagnosis within the DSM.
And that's a challenge. You were looking at a specific instance, but overcoming that that lack of skepticism or that lack of ability to tease out the science from the culture is something that's very important today.
I would absolutely agree. That's one of many resonances. Yeah, this question of what are facts and where can scientific data actually be trusted and verified, whether we're talking about climate change or COVID or the insurrection on January 6th. I think there are facts for each of those events and issues, and that it really behooves all of us to really think about sources and evidence and think about how those come into play. Beyond that, I do think this, in some ways, this story is a blueprint more broadly for social change and activism. And what's so inspiring, I think, to me, is when you look at how this change came about, there were so many different kinds of players and so many different forms of activism. So yes, there were the people that were invading conferences and shutting down, the speakers who were saying, we can cure gay people. And there's some amazing footage of that. But then, what's also amazing is there's footage of the activists saying, well, now we're here at your psychiatric meeting, let's have a dialogue. And that's one of the most heartening and amazing aspects of this whole story. And the fact that it's on footage is even better because we could show it. But this notion of, we're not only going to come in and yell and protest, but we want to talk to you and show you that we believe we are the experts on our lives, which is one of the taglines that the activists use. And we want to have a conversation. And then there were also the insiders working like on committees within the APA to refine the language and think about, the mechanism within this giant bureaucracy for proposing, that this issue be reviewed and considered. So there were many different forms of activism. And I think for people who don't consider themselves, sort of street activists who might not be comfortable shutting down a meeting or confronting, their opponents, I think another big takeaway from this film is there is, without question, a way to be involved and to make change. And there's so many different aspects of that in the film, and they weren't really coordinated. They might not even have, approved or necessarily wanted the other factions to be doing what they were doing at the time. But when you look at the big picture, there was this overall sense of momentum coming from many different facets and insiders and outsiders and activists and doctors, and a big part of it was sort of more progressive thinkers within the APA itself who were open to this dialogue and this reconsideration. And I would say, thinking about the process of change, when you look at the APA as an institution, one of the really remarkable pieces of this story is 50 years ago, the official line from the APA was, gay people are sick and need to be cured. And now the CEO and medical director of the APA is an openly gay psychiatrist who's interviewed in the film, so that is pretty emblematic that things can change. And the APA actually gave us some outreach funding to take the film to LGBT organizations and medical schools. And we're really doing a lot of on the ground grassroots work with some amazing partners and discussions. So I do think that that's a pretty encouraging example of the way that institutions can change in a relatively short time frame.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. And in an earlier discussion that we had, you had mentioned that there's a coordination in terms of the, I think it's the broadcast of the film with National Coming Out Day, which I wanted to make sure to bring in when you had said that the activists were talking about understanding their own lives, right, and wanting to be able to speak for themselves, and National Coming Out Day is really emblematic of that.
Absolutely. I'm going to put up another background here to as we talk about this, but the film is so much about coming out, and one of the most iconic moments in the story took place at the APA convention in 1972, where this psychiatrist who was totally justified in feeling like if he gave a speech about being a gay psychiatrist, he would be fired from his job, he would lose his medical license. The idea of a gay person actually being a practicing psychiatrist was totally off the table. But he did agree to share his story at this APA convention and gave this electrifying speech dressed in this crazy Richard Nixon mask and oversized tuxedo, and apparently nobody figured out who he was. So he did come out in a way but anonymously, and he was disguised and appeared as Dr. Anonymous. But that was a turning point in this story. And I think more broadly, the film is about coming out and about the power of being one's authentic self and expressing, openly that I am an LGBTQ person, this sexual orientation or same-sex attraction is a natural and normal variant of human sexuality. That's all embedded in the film. And it's fantastic that, as you said, PBS has programmed the broadcast of the film for National Coming Out Day, which is October 11th, Monday, October 11th on Independent Lens at 10 o'clock in most cities. And it's the opening film of their new season, which we're excited about. So PBS has been really an amazing partner. And I think that hook, it's I joke that it's National Coming Out Day isn't quite as famous as a holiday as Christmas or the 4th of July, but it is actually a moment to reflect on this idea that for LGBTQ people, coming out really is a form of activism, and telling one's coworkers and one's family that I am an LGBTQ person is really transformative. And that is so much about what the film is about. And I'm so happy that the broadcast will be on that date. And I think that will generate more interest and more visibility, and I hope more publicity.
Oh, fantastic. And one of the things that I wanted to mention is that we've programmed your work before. Love the way that you bring history to life, and the way that you do so, to pick up on a word that you mentioned earlier, a blueprint for change. That's part and parcel of what we do at the festival is offer models, blueprints, ideas that we hope people will take into their own lives to make the world a more just and peaceful place. And so I just wanted to acknowledge your efforts in that. And I think you really have, produced some terrific, impactful work, and for sharing it with our audience.
Well, that's very kind of you. I appreciate the feedback. And I would say we haven't really talked much about it, but a lot of the stuff I've done have been these really archive-driven films. We had two amazing archival producers on this project, Mridhu Chandra, who had actually worked with me on Brother Outsider, which is the Bayard Rustin documentary that I co-directed some time back, but it's timeless. And Luann Jones, also an old friend who I had worked with on Eyes on the Prize way back in the 90s, and she's a wonderful researcher. And we dug up some stuff that just hasn't been seen for 50 years, including actually John Fryer's speech at this convention. Again, that picture behind me is the kind of photographic chronicle of that moment. But after he died, John Fryer's estate donated more than 200 boxes to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And Patrick and I spent a week there going through these boxes, and we came across this little shoebox that was labeled miscellaneous audio, these unlabeled tapes that weren't really even in containers, and I sat there listening for hour after hour to like foreign language tapes and bird songs and random stuff. And then just miraculously, amid this collection of miscellaneous stuff, was an audio recording of his famous speech where he gets up and starts by saying, I am a psychiatrist, I am a homosexual, I am a human being. It's this really powerful plea for human rights. And before that, we had been thinking, like, what actor can we find to voice the text of the speech? Because we did have the written version, but it was such a great moment to find that authentic, genuine audio, which apparently even the archive didn't know they had, because it was just like, and who I understand when you have hundreds and hundreds of boxes, there's a value to making them accessible to the public before you've cataloged every single minute of them. But that was one of the breakthroughs on this archival search. And similarly, there's this episode of the David Susskind show, which was this weekly PBS talk show that had 7 out lesbians confronting Susskind about this issue. And that was the very first time that out lesbians were ever on national television. And there was also an episode of 60 Minutes from 1973 that we found that I don't think has been seen since 1973, with several of our storytellers being interviewed. So there's a ton of I think, new and unseen archival footage that we're happy about, because understandably, I think LGBT history films often have a lot of the same material, and it is a limited universe. But whenever some new additions are added to the canon, it's really, I think, great and can really deepen people's understanding of some of these less known, but I would say really pivotal moments in the overall arc of the progression towards equality. So
you touched on the fact that you have an impact campaign for the film. Can you talk a little bit about that, since it's so central to the Global Peace Film Festival mission is to support impact campaigns?
Absolutely. Well, we're partnering with quite a number of different organizations with several different goals. One of the big goals, which, yeah, it's great to talk about, even though attempts, the kind of treatments that were used and documented in the film, and we haven't talked about that either, there's so much to talk about, but as you see in the film, there were some very brutal treatments that were sometimes used to cure gay and lesbian people. Those included electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, sometimes even lobotomies. And there's footage of a man who underwent a lobotomy to correct or address his homosexuality. So that's in the film. Those kind of treatments don't happen anymore. But attempts to change or cure or convert LGBTQ people absolutely do happen through what is known as conversion therapy. And that practice is legal for minors in a majority of states. 20 states have outlawed it, but 30 states, in 30 states, it remains legal, including Florida, for instance. And so one of the big goals of our outreach campaign is to use this story from history to connect with that present day issue and these ongoing efforts to educate people about conversion therapy and to talk about why this practice is being banned by many states. So we've been partnering with groups like Born Perfect and the Trevor Project, and in some cases taking this to or having panels with state legislators in places where these bans are being considered, so that we can have a public forum that really focuses on what's happening now and how it connects to this story from 50 years ago. So that's one big focus, looking at conversion therapy and these ongoing efforts to cure LGBTQ people. We're also doing a lot with medical schools and sort of the upcoming generation of health providers, so that they understand this piece of history. And that, that's reaching a broad spectrum of health providers, LGBTQ, but also non-LGBTQ, just to have this moment be part of their awareness. We're doing a lot with LGBTQ history organizations. And then the other piece of the outreach campaign, which I'm excited about, is using the film to spark intergenerational dialogues. So we've been bringing together some of the storytellers from the film and other people in their 70s and 80s and 90s, partnering with groups like SAGE, which really focuses on LGBTQ elders, and having conversations with activists in their teens and 20s, and thinking about the story of the film and broader issues about coming out and how we think of ourselves and activism. So that is underway, and we're doing, we just shot this pilot for a series of short conversations between youth and elders that we're doing in partnership with a group called Future Perfect, which is focusing on LGBTQ youth. So that's one of the pieces I'm excited about, and those video conversations are in the pipeline. And I should say too, we do, as with some of my earlier films, the Rustin film and Electoral Dysfunction, which is a film about voting rights, we have some funding to create a school classroom version where we're creating a shorter version of the film and lesson plans and curriculum. And the intention is to be able to give that away to any teacher who wants it. So there's no barriers to access. So that's in the pipeline, not done yet, but coming soon. And I think, you know, we've gotten some preliminary feedback from teachers and from students, because we've done a bunch of screenings with high schools and young people, and it's been really heartening, even in a virtual, you know, kind of context, to understand the way that the story resonates with people. And I think too, you know, I should underscore, so much of what the film is these really courageous activists who are now in their 80s and 90s, if they're still with us, who took the stand and were willing to put their, you know, reputations and livelihoods on the line at a time when, you know, virtually every state had sodomy laws, and being gay was really, and being open about it was quite a risky proposition. I think it's easy to forget how much things have changed in terms of the price of openness and the, you know, the risks that our activists were taking. But it is really a heroic story on so many levels, and it's, you know, to have audiences get that and respond to the heroism and the bravery and the, you know, the sense of justice that our storytellers embody has been very affirming.
That's great. So just to wrap up, how can our audiences support your work?
Well, in the short term, as I mentioned, the PBS broadcast is coming up October 11th. So tuning in to that, or it'll be streaming on PBS for 30 days for free after that. So that's another way to watch. And, you know, I love the idea of house parties or virtual watch parties, people coming together to watch the film and talk about it would be one major form of support. We're also, you know, very keen to partner with organizations in our ongoing outreach campaign. And if people do want to reach out, they can contact us through cureddocumentary.com. There's a easy contact link there. So I'd love to hear from people, and if people have ideas for campus events or community events, you know, we would love to facilitate that and help get materials to you and access to the film. So that's another way people can get involved. And you know, the outreach campaign is ongoing also after the broadcast. So if people are inspired by this story, I would love to hear from them, and love to make sure they have whatever materials they might need to help, you know, amplify the story and have access to the film.
That's fantastic, Bennett. Thank you so much. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk through all these really important issues with us. And I want to thank everyone who's watched the film, and encourage them, if they've seen the film, to go to cureddocumentary.com and check out the ways to get involved and to contact Bennett and you know, to participate in this ongoing movement. And please do go to peacefilmfest.org to find out more information about the upcoming festival, and also keep in touch with the Global Peace Film Festival throughout the year. We will certainly be updating you on opportunities and updates regarding our films and filmmakers from the 2021 Film Festival. Follow us on social media, consider joining our newsletter, but again, check out peacefilmfest.org so that you can get the full scheduling information for our in-person screenings beginning September 20, running through September 26, and our virtual streaming program, which starts September 27 and runs through October 3. Again, thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next Glow.